You triggered me. People keep asking me about building apps in video game engines. I said I wouldn't talk about Flutter anymore, but I want to put this one down for good. Stop writing your apps in game engines. Let's talk about what I mean here and think through what an app even is, because I feel like most of the time people talk about Flutter, they're failing to understand what Flutter is, what problems it solves, and what an application even is in the first place. I'm trying to define this as a spectrum. The way I think about this is left to right here, we have doesn't need native stuff. And on the right, we have does need native stuff. Think cameras, accelerometers, push notifications, all the native features that your phone or whatever platform offers to the developer. So if you're just making a checkout for your Amazon grocery app, you probably don't need many of these native features, if any at all. But if you are making a camera app or an AR app, you probably need a lot more of these features. From bottom to top, we have the video game spectrum, where on the bottom here, it's no animation, everything's static. But on the top here, everything is animated. You're writing custom animation logic for individual details to make a really good interactive experience, probably a video game. One interesting project that, to start with a project, every application can be put somewhere on this chart. If we take something like Pokemon Go, for example, it's an interesting spot because Pokemon Go is very animated and interactive because it's a literal video game, but it also needs a lot of native stuff because it has so many native features built in, like using the accelerometer for figuring out what Pokemon you're looking at, all the fancy AR stuff, the GPS stuff, the push notifications. There's a lot going on in Pokemon Go that is native characteristics that are necessary for the application to be a good experience. As such, there's a lot of work that has to be done for the developers to build good integrations with that native layer, but they also have to build in a game engine if they want the animations and overall experience to be good at all. As such, I'm going to define a line here to make it a little easier to reason about these things. I'm going to call this the game engine line. This is the line where the thing you're making is animated enough that using an engine like Unity makes sense. The difference between something like Unity and a native platform like Kotlin or Swift or even React Native itself use the native primitives that the phone or whatever device is already providing. Apple provides a button in iOS that handles all of the accessibility, all of the screen reading stuff, all of the weird behaviors and touchability from different ways you can use an iPhone app. And their buttons are pretty good. I know, I click them all the time every day. Apple's button primitive is probably something we should use when we're building a phone app that has buttons and interactive features. But if we're mostly focused on the environment itself, the animated 3D experience, then Apple's stuff doesn't help us a whole lot. We don't get much benefit from Apple having a really good screen readable button if I need to render that button on a sign in a 3D world that I can walk up to and click. And that difference of the platform and the place the user experience lives being fundamentally different from the platform Apple built. That is where game engines come in. They say, screw all of your native stuff. We're not using any of that. We're going to use the processor though, and we're going to build our own rendering layer, our own engine for making things appear and disappear. It means it takes longer for these things to spin up, but it also means you can do much more, which is why a game like Fortnite could never be written in React Native or native code. And it's why Unity and Unreal Engine have found the success they've found by being a really good way for any developer to build a video game experience in an engine that can run against many different platforms. Somebody thought that was a good idea for applications. And this is where Flutter gets interesting. The thing I feel like many people miss about Flutter is that it's not a native platform. React Native renders a native button. It renders a native video player if you render a video player. It renders native things and calls native code. Flutter avoids doing that as much as it possibly can. Flutter is kind of like a web browser or a game engine for your apps, which means if you want one of those little toast notifications, like the pop-up that iOS gives you that says, hey, are you sure about this? Yes or no? Flutter can't let you do that. So instead of giving you an actual iOS feature, they literally take screenshots and stills of all of the different iOS features and bake them into the app bundle so that when you render on iOS, it will take that screenshot and overlay text on it. And the result is that every Flutter app has this terrible uncanny valley experience. You can feel it when you use a Flutter app. There are lots of simple, silly ways to check. Like if you use 2 fingers to scroll in Flutter, it scrolls twice as fast because they didn't implement their scroll layer correctly. Just stupid shit like that. It is the defining characteristic of Flutter. You're throwing away the entire native platform and the decades of hard work hundreds of thousands of developers have put into improving that native platform because you think your game engine is a better experience. So who is Flutter actually for? I am going to show you guys where I think Flutter's sweet spot is. I think there's a very thin space in this area here where if the application you're building isn't quite a game, but its defining characteristics are the animations, like an animation framework. Flutter can make a lot of sense. Rive is the new animation platform built with the goal of making performant animations easy to build. And because they're trying to make an animation layer that runs on every platform for these like cute graphic type animations with minimal interactions, Flutter makes a lot of sense for these types of cute things if you want to add a quick animation to an existing thing. Funny enough, they're not actually using Flutter in the runtime that you ship if you use it, but they're like a stripped down Dart-based alternative that they're working on. But their actual editor experience is all based on Flutter. And I think this is that rare sweet spot where Flutter actually makes sense, because the defining characteristic of this app isn't the interface, it's the interop between the interface and this animation framework. I was actually really surprised when I saw this project. It shocked me as though like, oh, wow, somebody found a real use for Flutter finally. But I cannot imagine anything above this line that isn't better suited to use a real game engine. And I certainly cannot imagine anything below this line that is better suited to not, or that isn't better suited to use something like React Native. And if we define this like more split, or like here we'll say at this point, no, I don't want to define the specific features where these lines get crossed, but let's say from here, at any point past this is web is fine. But let's say you have a mobile website, it's pretty good, it's doing everything you need, but now you need push notifications, or you have users that specifically have the habit of checking an application, you want to quickly build an app for them. I don't think rushing to React Native and certainly not rushing to Flutter is the right call here. I think there's a lot of space, I'd argue almost to like here, where web wrappers are fine. We can argue about where this line goes. It's all subjective, and I don't really care to argue it. The goal of this line is specifically to highlight that there's an area here where you have one or two features that aren't possible from the web, that you need to have a good experience for your users. I think this sweet spot here, especially if you're not going too crazy with the animation stuff, like this area here, is very compelling for a platform like Ionic. The benefit of Ionic is you get to write a website effectively using React components, all the stuff you normally do, and it is rendering in a web shell, but it gives you access to certain native features like push notifications, like the camera, without leaving the web platform. So you still get all your usual CSS, all the usual things. It's not a native app. Like anything before this line isn't going to be a native app if it's ideal. But at a certain point, you're building enough native stuff that it becomes irresponsible to not make the move. Thankfully, the vast, vast majority of what is doable on native platforms is doable through React Native. So I'll call this the React Native line. The goal of this line is to highlight that there's a huge area here where your functionality for your application might be more complex than how do I put this? The needs of your application might require things that aren't part of Ionic's layer or web wrappers. Let's say you're building an alternative Spotify or Apple Music listening experience on native. You need to call the native SDKs to play those things. Ionic might have some bindings for that, but it's way easier to work with a platform like React Native that gives you a much stronger binding layer and also has a community with hundreds upon hundreds of packages that interop with those native layers so powerfully. One of the biggest things I feel like doesn't get enough attention in the React Native world is not quite React Native. It's the insane amount of packages that Expo has published to make React Native development easier. All of these are native bindings to both iOS and Android, and often other platforms as well, where here, like Expo Font lets you load third-party fonts in your native app using the native platform. Expo File System lets you access the native file system directly. Expo Dev Menu is more for like dev stuff. Expo Crypto lets you do encryption using the native encryption and cryptography layers on both platforms. Expo Context gives you direct access to contacts. These aren't things that are rendering in JavaScript. These are very specifically native bindings that you call in JavaScript and then you use to call things. JavaScript isn't used to render things or do things in React Native. It's used to tell the native parts what to do. So the Expo image picker for example, will tell the native layer, hey, open the native image picker. And then when the native image picker is done picking, it sends it to JavaScript that says, oh, hey, we have images now. We should do something with them. We're going to send this to the native render layer to show you the images. All React Native really does is tells the native layer what to put where. It's not that big of an abstraction, and more calling things from native in React Native is getting easier. They're doing some really crazy work with the bridge between the two to effectively let you write Swift code and then call it in JavaScript with almost no latency. If you do the same thing in Flutter, you're going to be reinventing a lot of the patterns. Like the equivalent image picker in Flutter doesn't use the native image picker. It renders its own chaotic, like weird Flutter thing that is sideloading the images that it read from FS to try and render its own alternative view. Whenever Flutter offers UI that is similar to the native platform, it is explicitly not using the native platform. They are effectively, I've said this before, screenshotting the native features, ripping out the identifiable elements, and then running text like generation on top to make it look close enough to real. It's not a real application platform, and it is not a native platform. The most insulting thing for me is that the people who complain about React Native and shill Flutter complain about React Native for problems that only exist in Flutter. Flutter is not a native platform. People are mad at React Native because it's running code that isn't native on the platform, so they just abstract the whole platform away entirely? Makes no sense. The vast majority of people who regularly shill Flutter in my replies and in my community are just doing it because it's the thing they picked. And when I ask them to justify it, they say, well, it's cross-platform. Like, okay, and one of those platforms barely even works. Do you know the state of iOS Flutter right now? Do y'all understand how awful the animation layer currently is in Flutter for iOS? Did you see the jank there? Are you joking? This has been the case since iOS moved to Metal as the default engine. And the issue for this, as far as I know, is still open. Yep, this is still broken. And we have been promised a solution now. You have to use Flutter's engine if you're using Flutter. If there was a bug like this in React Native, you can just drop React Native and write it in native and just call the native thing. Flutter makes that nearly impossible because they're so far abstracted from the platform. It's insanity. We're not even talking about the website. We haven't even talked about code push. Like two of the biggest features that make React Native powerful, which is the interop of mindset between web and mobile, and theoretically the interop of code as well. Not the biggest fan of React Native for web, but it's a decent enough solution. People have shipped really cool things with it. But also, when you're trying to actually ship updates to your application, the abstraction that React Native gives you lets you ship a fresh JavaScript bundle that triggers different native code without having to go through the App Store. Obviously, if you ship new features this way, Apple's going to block you. But if you use this for bug fixes and small changes that don't matter that much, you are no longer blocked by the App Store on every single small thing you need to do for your users. And dumb stuff like having an April Fool's Day theme or like a random like 4th of July type theme or whatever the hell you want to do for a one-off feature. You book this event and you want to pin it to the top of your app. You can now do that with code push and with over-the-air updates trivially in React Native land. It is such a huge advantage to just throw away. I don't know why you would do it. The reason I hate talking about Flutter is all of these things are objectively true. And every time I argue about Flutter, somebody picks a random one of these things to get really huffy about and find some edge case about. And I'm like, okay, but what about the other two? And they say, oh no, those don't matter. We're just talking about this thing. All three of these things make Flutter basically unusable unless you have very specific requirements that both aren't affected by these negatives and also benefit from having a game engine that your application runs in. Realistically speaking, if you weren't considering Unity at some point, you shouldn't be considering Flutter at all. And this is what kills me with Flutter, is people building like e-commerce apps in Flutter. You're hurting your users, you're hurting your engineers, you're hurting yourself. Please stop doing it. Yeah, I think React Native with Expo is as good as you can get for multi-platform mobile right now. It's really hard to beat. I've said everything I have had to say about Flutter. I'm tired of people picking tech because it's the thing they like and use, and they haven't thought through what the impact would be. There are times I would use Flutter if I was working on an animation library, and there are times I would write Swift if I was working on a camera app. I feel like the Flutter people feel like Flutter should be this entire chart, and when I challenge them on that, they just shit themselves constantly. It is genuinely really hard to have conversations about Flutter because the average Flutter fanboy is a new developer, which is probably my least favorite part, is the people who are getting hurt the most by Flutter are new devs just looking for the first horse to bet on. And it really sucks for them because they're betting on a horse that's effectively gimped from the start. It really sucks. And I hope that we can be more responsible as we talk about these technologies, because I just don't think there's much room here and that there's much being built in this space. And again, to this day, I have seen a singular application that Flutter made sense for. But when I talk to Flutter engineers, their response is there is no application React Native makes sense for. As such, I think there's a conversation to be had here. Shout out to Luke, the one person from the Flutter side that's actually been pleasant to engage with and recognizes the state of the market and all of these failures, and has also been embracing new web platform stuff to take advantage of these cool new tools. Sadly, that is not the experience I've had with most people from the Flutter side. Feel free to prove me wrong in the comments and reply with actual insight on things I might not be understanding about Flutter, as well as where React Native makes sense in your Flutter mindset. But I have a feeling when we scroll down the comment section in this video, it's going to be a bunch of Flutter fanboys shitting themselves saying, I don't understand anything about applications. So prove me wrong, guys. I'd love to see it. This was fun as always. Appreciate each and every one of you, even the ones who are here to shitpost, because yeah, it helps the algorithm. Thank you guys as always. Stop putting your apps in game engines. Peace, nerds.